Anthony Fauci joined The View and responded to threats by some Republicans to criminally charge him over his handling of COVID-19. Let's watch.
Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene isn't the only Republican that's actually calling for your criminal prosecution or imprisonment. How seriously do you take those threats?
You know, obviously, you always take threats that people make seriously, but I quite frankly don't know what they're talking about. What are the charges? That you saved millions of lives with the vaccine that you helped develop, or that you got people to do things that were interventions that made them more safe against a deadly pandemic that killed 1.2 million people? So if trying to save people's lives is a crime, then I'm guilty.
He also addressed how he felt contradicting Trump back in 2020.
It was very painful for me. I have a great deal of respect for the presidency of the United States of America. I've served 7 presidents, so it wasn't like, wow, isn't this cool that I'm contradicting the president? It was very, very painful, but I had to do it.
Fauci also took the opportunity to share his concerns for the future of America.
What happened with COVID, as I think was represented by the hearing a few weeks ago, was just pure ad hominem and vitriol. And that really took me by surprise. I thought that there would be that kind of give and take and respect each other's disagreements. And that's the thing that worries me, not only about what I have to face, but about the direction of the country and the social order and our democracy. It's very threatening, I think.
It's in jeopardy. It's in jeopardy.
For Anthony Fauci to sit there and say that the claims against him are, well, I saved so many people, I think it would serve him better if he actually addressed what's on people's minds right now. We had Rand Paul on the program yesterday talking about, the Senate hearing on the potential lab leak theory, investigating the origins of COVID. A lot came up, and I was surprised that he said out of 11 Democrats that were supposed to show up for the committee, only 2 did. And he couldn't speak to what was happening in the subcommittee, on the House side, where they've had 27 hearings in the last 15 months or so. But it's shocking that when Anthony Fauci was the head of NIAID, the National Institutes for Virology Research in the United States, that's not the exact acronym, but they essentially are tasked with investigating, allergy and infectious diseases. That's the acronym. And he's allocating funding to ensure that people are kept safe, that we have responses when pandemics and epidemics emerge. And he was responsible for allocating funding to EcoHealth Alliance in New York City, which was partnered with the Wuhan Institutes of Virology. And a lot of people are concerned that the reason the lab leak theory didn't get the attention they believed it deserved to was in part because of Anthony Fauci's leadership. And he's denied this in the hearings and said, well, I responded to an email and said, if this is real, we should investigate it. But why is the initial response, if this is real, and not just we'll investigate it? And people being treated like conspiracy theorists for wondering where the origin of COVID was. Now there's some evidence to suggest that a lab leak theory has merit, and people are admitting to this. But I think a lot of people, in hearing what Anthony Fauci is saying there, don't feel heard, don't feel seen, and he would be better off to just address it.
Yeah, and he was actually eliciting other scientists to write op-eds for well-respected scientific publications, arguing against the lab leak theory and claiming that all evidence pointed to the virus being of natural origin. And people are not trying to go after him for charges related to just opinions he gave on the pandemic, but the fact that he went in front of Congress and lied about funding gain-of-function research. He said repeatedly during his first visit there after the pandemic that it never happened, that no money went to it, and tried to redefine what gain-of-function research was to basically shield himself from any liability for the lab leak out of Wuhan. And even recently, in addition to this View appearance, he's going on his little book tour. Of course, he's going to make hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars off of the back of his horrific pandemic response. And he said in, I believe it was a CBS interview, that he still does not accept the idea that the lab leak theory is the most likely explanation for COVID-19. He's claimed that most scientists still believe that natural origin is most likely, which even from that perspective is not true. But we also have the Energy Department, the State Department, the director of national intelligence, all saying that they have evidence that points to lab leak being most likely. So he's just lying out of both sides of his mouth repeatedly, and it's such a slap in the face to the American people who either lost loved ones to COVID, but also lost loved ones to suicide, to drug overdoses, to alcoholism, individuals who didn't get health screenings because they were told that the hospitals were overwhelmed by COVID and they shouldn't go and get their cancer screenings or whatever other ailment that they might have had. There are people who were not able to see their loved ones in the hospital while they were dying alone. There were people who were literally not able to go to funerals and bury their loved ones because of the proposed restrictions that came down from people like Dr. Anthony Fauci and the CDC. So he's wreaked havoc among millions of Americans' lives. And for him to take credit for the vaccine, oh, I saved millions of Americans through the vaccine. It was Trump who authorized Operation Warp Speed, not Dr. Anthony Fauci. I mean, this guy is just ridiculous. He needs to go away. And I think Republicans are right to try to hold him accountable for the one part of this that could be criminal, which is lying to Congress. But for him to go on The View and just arrogantly give this air of, oh, I'm the science, as he likes to remind everybody, is just disgusting.
When you're someone like Anthony Fauci and you're responding to this unprecedented pandemic, we don't have a lot of information. I get that you have to make decisions where you can't have randomized controlled trials and do full assessments of what the data shows about the effectiveness of public health policy and the recommendations. But it was so poorly communicated, and it was communicated in a way of like, we have science and that's why this is true, when in reality they did not have extensive research for the recommendations they were making, but they could just simply tell the public, we're making decisions with the best information we have. We don't know how effective this will be, but this is a precaution that we think will help people. That's your role as the CDC, to make public health policy in that way. And someone like Anthony Fauci being the head of this COVID response effort, to say now, like, that I'm just under fire because what? I created a successful vaccine? It's a little bit sick. I would rather someone like that say, we realized that we handled a public health crisis in ways that was wrong. At this point, there should be some reflection that they were being so patriarchal to say to the public, we don't need a state that acts like our parent and says, oh, don't worry, we figured it all out for you. We need a state that says, this is the information, this is the science, and we trust you as the public to understand it. But to act like the public is ignorant and can't raise valid questions is ridiculous. There was one point when now a lot of virologists are saying that, there is some evidence that point to a lab leak theory, but the preponderance of evidence suggests a zoonotic origin. At one point, the zoonotic origin was called racist, to say it came from an open air market in China, or xenophobic. And so I think we're at a point where maybe after some more research in a few months, we could see that narrative shift again, because it shifted so many times without a lot of transparency.
And one of the big arguments between Fauci and Trump was over closing the border with China, because that was considered a xenophobic move as well, even though all evidence at the time pointed to the origin of the virus being somewhere in China. So for him to sort of throw Trump under the bus for making the right decision in that case is ridiculous. I think he's being insulting to people who have suffered vaccine injury as well. The New York Times recently actually did a great feature in their Sunday edition about people who have had vaccine injuries. He also, might have been trying to operate on the best information he had, but that's not a good enough explanation, because he actively denigrated and pushed out people who challenged his idea of what the response should be. That's exactly what Murphy v. Missouri in front of the Supreme Court is about, is that epidemiologists who had a different opinion on what the proper pandemic response was were systematically silenced by people in the federal government, whether on social media or they were pushed out of their workplaces. Dr. Scott Atlas was advisor to the Trump administration during coronavirus, and he was a doctor at Stanford University at their Hoover Institute, and he was pushed out of the administration, threatened with his job, because he said that the lockdown should be restricted to the most vulnerable people, and that people who are not at high risk of having a severe infection or dying from COVID should be able to live their daily lives and go to their jobs and be with their kids, and kids should be able to go to school. And on the school point, Dr. Fauci recently defended the long-term school closures by saying, well, we really only did it for a couple of weeks, and then everybody else was free to do what they wanted to do, except he was the one on TV ahead of the fall semester in 2020 telling people that that kids were going to die if they went back to school. And then in 2021, again, telling news anchors that he recommended that areas with high COVID infection should not send kids back to school, and that it could be a situation where kids are remote for years. So for him to do this revisionist history of, well, all I did was give recommendations and people were free to do what they want to do, when we had systematic social media censorship at the behest of the federal government, we had Dr. Fauci warning people that they were going to be grandma killers and murderers of their fellow Americans if they didn't follow his recommendations, all while covering up the origin of the virus. Like, it's a ridiculous notion that he is going to try to pretend that he was just giving advice when he was really issuing effectively mandates for the entire American populace, and now criticizing Trump for pushing back on some of it. It's unbelievable.
I think also so much of the policy, especially around sending kids to school, at a time when there was very limited data to suggest that the virus was being transferred among children at school, and people were saying, hey, we don't have a lot of data on this. It looks like it might be pretty safe to have kids in school. There were so many very loud middle-class people with the resources, and a lot of upper-class people as well, with the resources to have their kids attend school from home. And there was a lot of working people that didn't have Wi-Fi, that didn't have laptops, that this kind of policy, they had to go to work. Of course, this kind of a policy meant that their kids wouldn't get an education at all. They don't have childcare for them. They can't afford it. And simultaneously, when there was some strict regulations about movement, about masking, about social distancing, they were not applied in the warehouses across America, the Amazon warehouses that were servicing these middle and upper class homes that were taking to online ordering, skyrocketing Amazon's profits because they could afford to pay to not go to the store, not be in person, and they could work from home. When you had workers like Pushan Brown at Amazon that at the beginning of the pandemic was assigned this job of testing workers coming in and out of the warehouse for COVID herself with her hands and no PPE. And she died early on in the pandemic. Her sister Christina is raising her kids now. And it's a devastating situation, and Christina's just dedicated her life for justice for working people. So at a time when the restrictions were strict and they were protecting the upper and middle class, the working class was forgotten.
Yeah, those people outsourced their risk to members of the lower middle and working class. And I remember there was a New York Times article early on in the pandemic that was tracking how far people were driving away from their homes. And the headline was all about how basically rural people were the drivers of the pandemic because they were traveling the most during the early months. And I just looked at this data, and it was like based on who drove more than 10 or 20 miles away from their house. Rural people have to drive that far just to get to a grocery store. They have to drive that far to get to work. They have to drive that far on a daily basis just to do basic parts of living their life. And the New York Times was treating them like they were intentionally flouting pandemic restrictions because they wanted everybody to die, or because they were conspiracy theorists that didn't believe COVID existed, without acknowledging the realities of them having to travel just to live.
Absolutely. And I think people in politics, people making decisions who are consultants, and people in media don't have family members in rural areas. They don't come from a working class background. So this perspective's hard to find other than on Rising here.
That's going to do it for us this week on Rising. And it was great being with you today, Jess.
Yes, it was great being with you as well. Amber, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like listening while you're on the go, we are available wherever you listen to your podcast. Bye, y'all.
Bye.